So if you don't know the Writer's Workshop, it's very prevalent in English and grade level classes. They've done tons of studies on them, and it's shown to increase the literacy skills of students. So the way it works is it starts with a mini lesson. This is a 10 to 15 minute time period of whole group instruction by the teacher. It's explicit. It focuses on one strategy or skill and one only. Then students are given some time to write independently or maybe revise an older piece, and where they apply this skill, the teacher conferences with students and gives one-on-one feedback to make sure students are being guided in the correct direction of the skill. And then finally, there's a sharing portion of this where students share with their partners or with the teacher to show their mastery of the mini lesson. You might be asking yourself, really, what does a writer's workshop have to do with my class? I teach history. But if we look at the direction that all of these national institutions are going in terms of social studies curriculum, on the screen here, I have the National Council for the Social Studies C3 framework. If you look at Dimension 3, evaluating sources and using evidence, this is entirely tied to writing and the ability to write. If we look at the Common Core state standards for history, there are writing standards for being able to write argumentation. And again, there's this focus on primary and secondary sources, which usually will involve some kind of writing application for students to show what they know. Even when we look at our AP classes, US history, their FRQs are usually there's some sort of argumentative writing piece that is very specific to the discipline of history. And really, beyond standards and curriculum, we have an incentive to have our students write in the classroom. Studies show that writing tasks help students process content knowledge, which is very useful in the classroom as long as students are equipped with the skills necessary to participate in these activities. I think most of us can see a need for writing in the content areas and specifically in history, but what we don't hear or see a lot of history teachers talking about is how to teach writing. Specifically, what research tells us is that explicit instruction is what students need to be successful in writing. This is something that many of our students don't come to us with because they've never actually written anything specific to the history discipline. There's a specific style of writing that occurs in history that students often don't know. In fact, a survey and a study done on writing in the middle school asked various teachers from various schools across different states how much direct instruction time they spend daily on writing. And as you see from the graph, language arts teachers 11 minutes, social studies only 5 minutes, and science even less at 2. And this really isn't to say that there isn't a need for explicit instruction in the classroom. In fact, Hexer in 1971 points out some differences in the history discipline, writing in history, that is specific to history alone and not seen in really any other content areas. First, students really need to understand sourcing their information. They need to understand how to provide quotes, how to look at the quality of sources, how to be detailed enough when they explain their sources, and how to give examples when writing. They need to understand argumentation in history is not the same as argumentation in other disciplines. You need data and evidence that are specific to history, and they come in a variety of different methods. Sometimes it's a picture, sometimes it's a speech, very different than classic argumentation. And then finally, there's framing evidence. Students really need to understand bias. They need to be able to compare two pieces of evidence right next to each other, and all of these things need to be communicated through writing, which makes it really hard for students to be successful when writing in the history classroom. Studies show that even college students struggle with writing in the discipline of history. They have difficulty constructing arguments that are specific to historical context and relating it to issues. And really, they have a hard time getting beyond just reciting facts and reproducing arguments made by other people. And I think these are two things that our students struggle with as well, which is why they need more explicit instruction in the history discipline. So we have this problem of not enough explicit instruction that is specific to writing in history, and I have a solution here. The mini lesson and the writer's workshop. So providing small 10, maybe even 5-minute lessons at the beginning of the class period that focuses on one specific skill that is specific to writing in the history discipline, and then giving students time to practice. Of course, there's also the conferring and doing the conferencing and sharing, but the importance here and the focus is really the mini lesson. So the mini lesson is given to the entire class. They're very short, usually 5 to 15 minutes in length. A majority of your time should really be allowing students to practice this skill. So you really need to pick one thing, one skill, one technique, one process in the writing. Doing more than one gets a little too confusing, and this is the beauty of the mini lesson. It makes it easier to focus in on one thing. You're always going to want to provide a mentor text, or you're going to model the technique so students can see how it's used. And then you give students time to practice, and whether that be revising an old piece or writing something new, but they really need to practice this skill. So political cartoons are used in a lot of historical writing. They're used as evidence a lot of times, particularly in DBQs. But students often have a hard time describing political cartoons in a detailed enough way where it can actually be analyzed. So what I did is I took a cartoon that I had my students use in the past, and I have an actual excerpt of how the student described this cartoon on the right-hand side. So this description that the student gave is not very specific. So I did a mini lesson on this, on political cartoons, to show students how they should be describing these things when they provide evidence in their writing. So in the mini lesson, I model or I use a mentor text to show an adequate description of what a political cartoon should be when you're writing. On the right-hand side in bold, you'll see an example from another student that I use as a mentor text in my mini lesson. So once I have this example and I go over the content of a good description of political cartoons, I allow my students to practice independently. The independent practice can actually be a new political cartoon that you see below. It can be a previous piece that they wrote about, but really you just need to give them time to implement the skill and to specifically look at each student's work and give them feedback. So that is the mini lesson. I hope you found that helpful. On this slide here, I put some possible topics that might be interesting for you to cover as a mini lesson that are relevant to writing in the history discipline. So I hope this helped.